Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take dense academic sources and, well, we try to pull out the core ideas that really matter for understanding ourselves and others. Today, we're tackling a really challenging but I think incredibly insightful piece from Psychoanalysis. It's by Thomas Ogden from 1996, called The Perverse Subject of Analysis. Now, when you hear perversion, your mind probably jumps straight to certain kinds of sexual acts, right? Maybe judgment, classification. But at Ogden's work here, it shifts the focus entirely. He's saying the analysis of perversion is not fundamentally about cataloging sex acts. It's really about understanding a deep, complex defensive structure within the psyche. That's a big shift. So our goal for this deep dive is to get a handle on this link between compulsive sexual excitement, erotization, and this profound underlying feeling of internal emptiness or deadness. We want to understand how some people create this kind of dazzling but ultimately illusory sense of being alive, just to avoid facing what Ogden calls the stillbirth of the self.
That's right. And crucially, it's not just about the individual. Ogden emphasizes that we're analyzing an intersubjective dynamic. This deep dive is really about the perverse countertransference, which sounds complicated, I know, but it basically means this unconscious drama that gets created between the patient and the analyst in the therapy room. A drama specifically designed, unconsciously, to keep both of them away from that core feeling of deadness in the patient.
Okay, let's unpack that motivation then, because it seems paradoxical. If someone's really active, maybe charismatic, exciting, why are we talking about deadness? What's this whole elaborate psychological setup actually protecting them from?
Well, the core issue Ogden identifies is the defensive use of specific kinds of sexualization. Or, maybe better put, the creation of highly charged, erotized situations. And the function is to shield the person from facing this raw, often terrifying experience of psychological deadness. It's this deep lack of a spontaneous feeling of just being alive, being real.
But wait, if they're constantly chasing excitement, don't they feel alive in those moments? Isn't that the point? How do we tell the difference between, healthy excitement and this defensive kind?
Oh, that's the trap. That's the devastating part of it. The compulsive erotization, it becomes the only way they know to create an illusory sense of vitality. It feels real, but it's constructed. They essentially subvert acknowledging their own inner emptiness by constantly pulling other people, partners, friends, even the analysts, into these exciting, erotized, sometimes dangerous substitutes for genuine, unpredictable life. It's like they're trying to squeeze life out of something they unconsciously feel is already dead or empty.
Wow. So they're trying to convince themselves and everyone else that they exist, that they're vibrant. And Ogden connects this to a really quite devastating idea, the stillbirth of the self. What does that actually mean? Does the person feel like they literally weren't born properly?
In a psychological sense, yes, something like that. This whole defensive structure seems rooted in a specific internal fantasy about the self never fully coming into being, and the stillbirth idea. It often links back to an unconscious fantasy of what Ogden calls empty parental intercourse.
Empty parental intercourse.
Yeah, meaning the foundational relationship, the one between the parent that should be life-giving, was experienced by the child unconsciously as fundamentally fake, mechanical, empty of real feeling. So if you feel like you came from that kind of emptiness, like you're the product of a void, the stillborn infant in Ogden's terms, then just living your life telling your own story can feel like an inherent lie. A performance, a charade.
A charade.
And that charade has to be constantly exciting, constantly dramatic to keep the illusion going, to keep the feeling of non-existence at bay.
That makes the analyst's position incredibly difficult then. If the patient is fundamentally living out an empty performance, the analyst is bound to get drawn in somehow. What does this look like when it actually shows up in the therapy room?
Ogden describes the result as the perverse subject of analysis. It's like an illusory narrator takes over. Very engaging, tells fascinating stories, creates this erotized drama, but it's fundamentally hollow. And crucially, this isn't just the patient's creation, it's jointly constructed. Both the analyst and the patient unconsciously collaborate to build this third subject in the room.
A third subject.
Yeah.
Which is the lie itself.
Exactly. The lie, the charade, becomes a character in the room. And this means the analyst can't just sit back and be objective. Not really. To even begin to understand what the patient is communicating, the analyst has to engage with this perverse scene, has to listen to the siren song, as Ogden puts it. If the analyst just says, oh, I'm detached, I'm observing, they're actually creating a false picture because they are involved unconsciously. They're part of the duet.
Okay, but if the analyst is drawn in, potentially becoming part of the problem. How do they ever gain real insight? How do you maintain any kind of therapeutic boundary if you're supposed to be participating in the lie?
Right, that's the critical question. And this is where Ogden emphasizes the technique of reverie. The analyst doesn't get understanding just by thinking logically about the patient's words. Instead, they have to pay close attention to their own seemingly random internal experiences during the session. We're talking about unobtrusive, mundane thoughts, feelings that pop up, daydreams, stray physical sensations, stuff that seems totally irrelevant.
Wait, hang on. You're saying the analyst's best data might be them zoning out, or thinking about lunch, or some weird image. That sounds incredibly counterintuitive.
It does, but those seemingly irrelevant internal drifts, they're often the first signals that the analyst is actually caught up in the perverse transference-countertransference. The analyst has to track those mundane thoughts because they can be clues to the unconscious dynamic being built between them. Often the understanding of their own role only clicks into place after the moment has passed.
Okay, that's a fascinating technical point. Relying on your own, almost involuntary mental noise. We definitely need an example to make this concrete. Let's talk about Ms. A. This is the main case Ogden uses. She came to analysis saying her marriage was a sham. But the really alarming part for her was realizing it did not bother her. She just felt lifeless.
So Ms. A presents with that core deadness. But her life story, anything but dull. She's middle-aged, grew up in this sort of high-stakes, glamorous world linked to the film industry. Her father had this secret bankruptcy, then rebuilt a whole real estate empire. So lots of performance, lots of keeping up appearances right from the start.
And the home environment sounds intense. Constant parties, drinking, drugs, cross-dressing, outrageous homosexuality, as she put it. And she felt totally invisible in all of it, like a prop. And just profoundly bored by how predictable all the supposed chaos was.
And here's the core lie she grew up with. Her parents had separate bedrooms for almost the entire marriage. The official reason was the mother's insomnia, but it was basically a ruse. Their real connection, their intercourse in that psychological sense, was solely focused on creating this exciting, powerful public image. It was fundamentally empty, fraudulent, and that became the unconscious template for her own life.
Right. So when she starts analysis, the analyst immediately notices this disconnect. She says she's lifeless, but she seems incredibly vital, entertaining. He even notes feeling like he's watching a detective movie, like Chinatown or something. Always intrigued, waiting for the next clue.
Exactly. She told stories nonstop, very entertaining, but it filled all the space. It served as a kind of substitute for genuine, spontaneous thought or feeling she needed to perform. And the perverse transference started subtly. She wasn't conventionally attractive, but she had this compelling, subtle sexuality in how she presented herself. The analyst found himself feeling this weird mix of pride and maybe a little guilt that he was her analyst, feelings he barely even registered consciously at first.
And then the erotized trap starts to become more concrete, more material, right? He starts looking forward to sessions. He notices small things, like how she lays her expensive designer coat down, always with the label visible, almost right at his feet. The conversation itself felt clever. But somehow flat, mechanical.
Yes, he was unconsciously getting drawn into the performance, the excitement, and the breakthrough using that idea of reverie we talked about came during a session where Mrs. A was talking about feeling totally disconnected from her husband, saying they were like strangers on a subway platform. Very bleak.
Okay, tell us about the car wash reverie. Because this part is wild.
Right. So while she's describing this marital emptiness, the analyst finds his mind completely drifting off, obsessed with the empty lot next to his office. He starts ruminating about this couple planning to open a car wash there. He sees them as unreasonable, unapproachable, and they're using this deafening commercial vacuum cleaner. He feels anxious, thinking this whole operation is somehow above the law, unstoppable.
Okay, wow. So this incredibly important insight emerges from him thinking about a noisy vacuum cleaner next door. That's bizarre. How on earth did he connect that back to what was happening with Miss A?
Well, the sheer intensity of the thought, the anxiety provoked, alerted him that something disturbing was happening right there in the room between them. He started to hypothesize. The deafening noise, the vacuum cleaner. Maybe that related to an unconscious fantasy about parental intercourse that was disturbing, loud, intrusive, but also fundamentally empty, a vacuum. And it was consuming his attention, just like the fantasy of the parents' relationship consumed everything. It was the sound of the original lie manifesting right there.
That interpretation of the vacuum, empty but overwhelming, it's brilliant. So what happened right after he had that internal realization?
That very night, Mrs. A had a really significant dream. She dreamt she was watching an old man, someone like the analyst, reading in this dark, kind of seedy office. And other people, including her, were secretly peering in through the window. She felt terrified of being caught, and also, she desperately needed to pee.
Ah, the reversal. She wasn't just being watched.
Exactly. It hit the analyst like a ton of bricks. She must have been watching him, watching her. She knew he was looking at the labels on her coats. What he'd rationalized as professional curiosity was instantly reframed as, well, prurient interest. His own secret excitement, his pride in being part of this special, erotized diet. It was never secret. She saw it all. She was watching him fall into the very trap her family had perfected.
So he thought he was the detective trying to uncover her secrets, but he was actually the one being observed. He realized he wasn't some savvy adult analyst in that moment.
No. He felt like a self-deceiving infant or child, peering excitedly, shamefully at the primal scene through a keyhole. He'd helped set the trap he thought he was springing, so the interpretation he eventually made focused directly on that dynamic, the shame and the excitement of secretly looking, and then the terror and shame of being caught in the act of watching so excitedly. It named the lie that had structured their whole interaction.
And what was the effect of actually naming that? Bringing that shared, unspoken, shameful excitement out into the open.
The effect was immediate and profound. Mrs. A fell into the first long period of silence they'd ever had in the analysis. She reported feeling understood but not exposed. It was like the endless performance. The need to constantly fill the space with exciting noise could finally pause.
And that stillness, that pause in the performance, allowed something else to surface. The truth she'd been running from.
It seemed so. Soon after, she had another dream. She dreamt she was a child who had polio. She couldn't move her legs. She felt intense terror, but also, surprisingly, a sense of calm and relief. This was interpreted as the first real acknowledgement, the first feeling of her emotional and sensory deadness, the paralysis, without immediately needing to flood it with frantic excitement. It was like the catastrophe she feared had already happened, but she hadn't allowed herself to experience it until that moment of stillness.
Wow. And only then, once that paralysis, that deadness was actually felt and acknowledged, only then could she start to connect the dots looking back.
Exactly. She then started talking about her past differently. Her high school promiscuity, cheating on exams. She described it as a full-blown obsession. The thrill wasn't really the sex or the cheating itself, but the risk, getting others to see her as mysterious, sexy, dangerous. And crucially, she admitted she was usually bored during sex itself, like watching an uninteresting television program. It revealed this whole inner world built on unreflective action and reaction, a desperate strategy designed to keep her from feeling overwhelmed or taken over by the messy, unpredictable inner lives of other people, or her own.
It really all comes back to naming that core lie, doesn't it? Ogden wraps this up by saying that the fundamental task of analysis in these cases is to accurately name the lifelessness at the heart of the transference. And recognizing that, feeling that emptiness, as terrifying as it is actually the first experience that feels truly alive. Because it's real. It's true.
Precisely. The perverse subject, as Ogden describes them, is trapped in this futile, exhausting cycle of trying to extract life from death, compulsively erotizing a void because they unconsciously believe there's no other source of vitality. All the excitement, the danger, the flirting with chaos, it's all a substitute for genuine, spontaneous human aliveness. And because of this constant performance, Mrs. A came to realize, as she put it, that it felt no longer possible to separate out in any meaningful way her own desires from those of others. She got lost in the show.
Completely lost in the performance needed to feel alive. It's a profound kind of self-erasure. So, if the whole point of this elaborate, often destructive, perverse drama is to avoid recognizing that internal emptiness, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener. Consider the smaller, maybe more mundane ways you might engage in self-deception in your own life. The little charades you perform, the small excitements or distractions you chase. What role might they be playing in protecting you, perhaps, from an uncomfortable but ultimately truthful moment of stillness?
That stillness, if you can bear it, might actually hold the most genuine experience of aliveness you can find. Something worth thinking about. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.